How y'all doing tonight? Thank y'all to Coke for hosting us here.
Woo! Let's give
yeah.
a round of applause.
I actually just moved to DC about a month ago, and so it's been really cool to be able to see new places in the city, new black spaces in the city. I know it's Howard Homecoming weekend apparently this weekend too. So
No bison, even though I'm not one.
yeah, that is too. So I'm going to read a little bit from my book. I am a journalist by trade, and so this book is about Greenwood, Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Race Massacre. And I actually moved to Tulsa to work on this project about 5 years ago. I lived there for 5 years, talking to folks, meeting folks, and really trying to craft a book that would be about not only the race massacre, but also the before and the after. One of my big sort of operating theories is that our history as Black folks can only be defined by trauma. It so often is. And the way history is written and the way we're portrayed in the news, pop culture. And so this book tries to really capture the humanity of all the people from Greenwood. And so I'm going to read 3 sections of the book, sort of the before, the origins of this place, the mythology around it, the massacre itself, and then a little bit of the after, what's going on in Tulsa right now. So I'm going to start actually with the first page of the first chapter, which I wrote. I wrote this book chronologically, so I had to one day just man up and start page 1. And so this is it. It's, do not hesitate, but come. Chapter 1, verse 1. They called it the Eden of the West. When boosters crafted tales of the land known as the Creek Nation, Indian Territory, and eventually Oklahoma, they wrote a fertile soil that could grow any crop, yielding shoulder-high acres of wheat and melons ready to burst in their succulent ripeness. They described a righteous realm, where any newcomer would have equal chances with the white man, while those who remained in the old world, the deep south, were slaves, allowed to be killed at any time. Most important to James Henry and Carly Goodwin, they spoke of good schools for colored children, places where the seeds of prosperity could be sown, and the one terrain that cannot be burned, stolen, or erased by an interloper, the terrain of the mind. James and Carly did not move to Oklahoma spontaneously, for spontaneity was not a luxury that Black people could afford. James was a quiet, deliberate man who saw success with a patient vigor. In the early 1900s, he and his wife lived on a segregated street in a small town in Mississippi called Water Valley, along with their 4 children, Lucille, James Jr., Anna, and the baby, Edward. Though they were Mississippi natives, the Goodwins read about life out west for years through a Black newspaper called the Oklahoma Safeguard. C.A. Buchanan, the Safeguard's publisher, had been a thriving newspaper owner in rural Mississippi before he was run out of the state by white folks for his racial utterances and disturbing effusions. Buchanan relaunched the Safeguard in Oklahoma in 1905 and hired sales agents to keep distributing the newspaper back home. James and Carly's names appeared in brief Safeguard news items recapping sick lists and social events in Water Valley, but the bulk of the newspaper was dedicated to describing, in vivid terms, the boundless opportunities Buchanan had discovered in Oklahoma. Here was a place where 3/4 of Black farmers owned their acreage, and more than 80% of Black people could read, a higher literacy rate than anywhere else in the Deep South. Between 1900 and 1920, Oklahoma's black population tripled as people trekked to the state however they could, on crowded trains or weary-covered wagons. A few even came on foot. Keep coming, Buchanan implored to his Mississippi readers. Quote, now is the time for the progressive Negro to come west to seek a home. It is superior to any other section of the United States. So that's the very beginning of the book. And I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 7, which is the massacre itself. Willie Williams awoke to the sound of gunfire. It was just past dawn as he walked to a western-facing window in his family's Greenwood Avenue apartment and peered outside. The white men who had reached the Frisco Depot were inching eastward along the railroad tracks. Armed with rifles, they trained their guns toward deep Greenwood as the night gave way to a dull morning gloom. Willie's father, John, perched himself in the family's corner bathroom, aiming his .30 Savage rifle out of a window facing southwest. John knew the trouble that was coming. He was among the men who had gone to the courthouse to guard Dick Rowland and witness the chaos that erupted downtown. Poking the barrel of the gun out of the window, he sniped the would-be assailants whenever they stepped out into clear view and gave them a clean shot. If anyone managed to enter the Williams building, he also had a repeating shotgun at his side that would dispatch them in close quarters. John had the upper hand for a time. The invading gunmen couldn't tell where the shots were coming from, but eventually, they recognized that the gunfire was erupting from the second floor of the Williams building and opened a fusillade onto the family's home. The bathroom window shattered as a hail of guns had blasted the structure. "We're gonna have to get out of here," John said. John, Lula, and Willie dashed out of the apartment, clattering down the stairs as more window panes exploded around them. When they stepped outside, they saw their neighbors fleeing in all directions. Some bolted east down Archer Street, away from the railroad depot where the whites had amassed. Others ran north up Greenwood Avenue. Women carried babies in their arms. A few nestled little ones in their wombs. Crouching low, the Williams family crept up Greenwood, past A.F. Bryant's drugstore, C.O. Netherland's barbershop, and the old Gurley building. They found safety in an old funeral parlor halfway up the block, where about 10 other men had already gathered. As the group caught their breath, Lula decided she was going to check on her mother, who was on Detroit Avenue at the western edge of the neighborhood. Always a self-possessed woman, she journeyed there without her husband's protection. This was still her neighborhood, and she would not be intimidated. Across the street from the Williams family, Mary Jones Parrish was trying to cocoon her daughter Florence in the cushion of a dual-fold sofa, hoping that the furniture would shield her daughter from a stray bullet. She likened the mob to a group of bloodthirsty wolves salivating over a carcass. Staying where she was as the hungry invaders approached would be suicide. Looking out of a south-facing window of the Woods building, she could see white men firing their rifles from atop the Middle State Mill on First Street, across the railroad tracks. They'd even hold a machine gun up there. When she heard a lull in the gunfire, she took Florence's small hand and guided her out of their apartment. Mother and daughter ran northward towards Standpipe Hill, another knoll topped by a large water tower that marked the western boundary of Greenwood. Parrish hoped their friend who lived in the area would take them in. But as soon as they approached the intersection of Easton Street and Detroit Avenue, she stopped. Many of the craftsman-style homes that lined the street were already on fire, with families' personal effects strewn across their yards. Towering above the homes on the hill was another machine gun manned by several white soldiers. Greenwood was surrounded. Evading the gaze of the weapon, Parrish and her daughter ran farther north. They eventually hitched a ride on a truck of another family escaping town. As their home faded into the distance, fires belched out black smoke, and turbid clouds drifted out in every direction. Parrish held her daughter close. She'd read about the racial violence in Chicago and Washington, D.C. in 1919, but never thought something similar, no, something worse, could happen in Tulsa. As the truck trundled eastward and the acrid taste of smoke began to leave her tongue, Parrish cast her eyes on her new horror. White men with rifles were climbing under planes in the airport just outside town. Their sights were set on Greenwood. So that section is a brief dive into the race massacre itself, and the book will go from there. The last section I'm going to read is actually the epilogue of the book. So I'm a journalist, and everything in the book is nonfiction, it's all factual. And this epilogue is sort of what I wrote after I sort of told the story of Greenwood, and sort of tried to offer a little bit more of my personal insight about, what I had observed there, living there, researching there, and trying to sort of capture the issue of justice that still has not been rectified there. People who don't know, there's been reparations cases going on for the last several years in Greenwood. There's 2 living survivors of the race massacre, 109 and 110 years old.
Still come home.
Yeah, and they have not received any kind of justice whatsoever from the city, from the state, from the country. And so this epilogue sort of touches on that dynamic. Right is slow and tardy, while wrong is aggressive. Attorney and race massacre survivor B.C. Finger wrote in his autobiography. That's the only way you can survive. For more than a century, Greenwood has been grappling with wrong in all its combative forms. Wickedness flamed white hot in 1921, but the embers continued to burn long after. And relief aid withheld during the Great Depression. And wartime jobs denied during World War II. And discrimination proclaimed loudly on whites-only signs and quietly in land deeds for residents by people of African descent. In urban planning brochures featuring smiling black faces and words laden with double meaning. Blight, renewal, progress. What happened in Tulsa at each historical juncture was not unique, but was uniquely well documented. For all the talk of a conspiracy of silence hanging over the massacre, there are a shocking number of images of the event. More than 100 photographs of houses aflame, black victims lying dead in the street, white Tulsans admiring their gruesome handiwork. That was the mob's catalog of events. But Greenwood residents kept their own ledger too, captured in interviews conducted by Mary Jones Parrish, oral histories passed down by W.E. Williams and Abel Little, poetry written by A.J. Smithman, and historical accounts reprinted decade after decade by the Oklahoma Eagle. Tulsa wanted badly to forget, but Greenwood demanded the city remember. They must pay, and they will pay, Ed Gilman Sr. said from the pulpit of Mount Zion in 1971, when the number of massacre survivors still told in the thousands. Restitution is still due, his granddaughter Regina Goodman said, 50 years later. By then, there are only 3 known living people who witnessed the attack with their own eyes. But the legions of departed survivors have told their story enough times to grandchildren, neighbors, historians, and journalists that the memory of the massacre transformed from a private burden to a collective one. First the city, then the state, and finally the nation recognized that what happened in Tulsa was not a bizarre outlier, inevitable arc of history toward justice. It was a warning buried in the past that any society, no matter how noble it purports to be, can be wrecked by hate and violence that destroys people's lives and livelihoods, and see it rationalized from the highest seats of power. Wrong is aggressive. All right, thank you all so much for being out here. Thank you for reaching out.
Let's give Victor another round of applause. I visited Tulsa a couple of years ago and did a tour of what was Greenwood and still is. And it's sobering to see what those individuals went through, and to think that people have lived to be 108, 109, still fighting for justice, but still not receiving justice. So we have to fight for those who can't fight for themselves anymore. So Victor, thank you for this factual account, and there's a lot for all of us to learn. Our next author is Soroya Palmer, and her book is The Origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts, a novel. So if we can give her a round warm of applause as she comes up.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Sankofa. This is my second time reading here. I love this bookstore, and I love coming to DC, even though I'm a Brooklyn girly at heart. But I'm gonna read from, this is my novel, and the novel is about 2 sisters who are really close. They grew up in Brooklyn, and you kind of see how their bond shifts over time with their family's turmoil. The mom is sick, the father is, cheating and violent, but like through everything, they tell a lot of stories. And one story the father always tells is about a time he faced the rolling calf in Jamaica with his brother, Harold. And for those who aren't familiar, rolling calf is like a big ghost story in Jamaica, and it's a bull that breathes fire and has a chain tail that rattles. And basically this story comes in the middle of the book. It's a flashback where you realize that it actually happened. And the father, so it's about the father, Nigel, and his brother, Harold. Was like, Oscar never heard the stories before. No, wait, sorry. Hold on. That's not where I would have started. My bad. No. Oscar is the lover of the brother. Harold is the brother. Okay. It was then that the boys thought they heard something. A chain rattling, cracking against tar road and tree trunk. It's true, it smelled of sausage, but not of any sausage you've ever eaten. You could smell the things they put inside it, the things you pretend aren't there when you devour it with stewed tomato or jerk sauce. You know which parts I'm referring to. I won't get into it. I'll just say that besides the smell of insides, it also smells revoltingly familiar. You are now aware that the calf was once human. You're aware he could be you. The smell of fire came next, and then the sight of the beast. Blood rose from the rolling calf's nostrils like heat. Pus dripped from his mouth. The horns atop his head were gnarled and knobbed as tree trunks, much larger than the fake horns on Harold's head earlier. His eyes swirled like lava, his chain tail snapped the ground, and the earth separated into minerals. Nigel realized that the calf had probably come for the rest of his chain. Instinctively, Oscar moved closer to Harold and put his arms around him. How were they supposed to wind up victorious in their mission, with this lanky batty boy in their way? And more importantly, why did it always seem to Nigel that he was never enough for his brother? Nigel watched their embrace in disgust for just a moment when he had a thought. Why not teach this batty boy a lesson once and for all? He slipped the chain-link tail into Oscar's knapsack, knowing that all he would have to do once the calf began to chase him was to stab him in the leg with the penknife, and then drag him into the sea. Oscar would be fine, of course, and hopefully all the wiser. And yet, with one swift movement, the calf charged into Harold and Oscar with his horns, and they toppled over. The boys began to run. The boys began to scream. Old Man Toby moved closer to Batty Boy number 1 and 2 to try and explain to them of their sins. Of course, no English words came out of his mouth. Just fire and sounds whose only purpose must have been to put fear into man. The calf snarled at the boys, pointing his horns at them for effect. And then Battyman 1 and 2 fell to the ground and rolled around like girls. He heard his tail crack the grass. He charged the 2 boys with his horn and they scattered. He followed the boys into the bush. The third boy, who had taken the rest of his chain, disappeared in the bushes opposite the Battyman. He'd deal with him later, of course. He decided to start with the redskin boy, and he pushed him down with his horn. His initial plan was only to preach to him, but there was a hunger growing inside him. He opened his lips to the boy's arm. The redskin boy began to cry. Just a taste, he said to himself. A taste won't kill him. A taste will only teach him a lesson. But ooh, tastes so good, better than sweets, better than the touch of a woman. The blood filled him now. His body began to cool down, as if he were swimming in the ocean, like a wave breaking overhead, like the sun setting over his eyes, as though he were swimming in the middle of a rainbow. He could feel the boy's limbs breaking apart against his teeth, felt the bones crackle and pop inside his mouth, felt them swish around inside his body. Was like Oscar never heard the stories before. You never run from the rolling calf. But then Harold started running too. Watching his brother roll around on the ground screaming, he felt a growing horror inside him, and he worried he might throw up. He ran toward the calf with his bag of sand and salt water in hand. When he caught up to where they had fallen, he cried out at the sight before him. It was Oscar lying on the ground, barely conscious and bleeding, as the calf took a bite from his left arm. The calf looked up at Nigel to see his bag of sand. Steam evaporated off his hanging tongue. His breath smelled of smoke and rotten meat. The calf was quickly approaching him now. The steam and the smoke came together to make wind, and you remember what I told you about the wind, don't you? Well, on this day, the wind herself wore a steel blue dress. She ran circles around the rolling calf's eyes and mouth, scaring the flies and mosquitoes away from landing there. Nigel thought of his father's warning, and yet the calf seemed scared too. His fiery breath wavered in the breeze as he shook from side to side. The calf tried to sink his hooves deeper into the earth for balance from the wind. Nigel thought that maybe his father was wrong, that maybe the wind was a sign of something, like a miracle, or at the very least a good diversion. Nigel used the opportunity to stick his penknife into the ground, while Harold attempted to carry Oscar into the bushes to hide. And then came the rain. It started as a leaky pipe kind of drizzle, before coming down at a steady pace. Small puddles transformed into pools all around them. Nigel took out his whip and tried to herd the beast toward the ocean. Only a few kilometers from where they stood, the calf looked afraid. His fire was dying. All that came out of his mouth now was smoke. He began to cough. His horns began to shrink. The wind herself swirled around his face like a small tornado. Now Nigel used this opportunity to gloat, to consider that maybe fathers didn't actually know everything. Sometimes they existed only to make you feel less than. He took out his penknife and lunged at the calf like it was his sword. The knife grazed the calf's neck and blood spurted. He was whimpering now. Nigel laughed. You see here? He sneered at the wind. But Nigel didn't notice the hot air become cold. The wind's shy laugh as she opened her arms to the sky, her blue dress flying upward, turning gray, turning black, how her dress was ripping up stones and wood planks off houses, how cheap folding chairs took flight. Nigel stood transfixed to the pieces of steel blue, creating moon shapes in the air. Didn't anybody ever tell him not to push against the wind? She's unpredictable. Hurricanes and tornadoes come out of nowhere, they say, and it's true. She'd never admit it to anyone, but underneath all that bravado, all she really wants is a little recognition. For the world to know that even the wind gets a little lonely sometimes. It's no wonder she feels the need to be everywhere at once. Meanwhile, Harold picked up Oscar, heading for the hills. The rolling calf came charging right after them, leaving Nigel to admire his lunge. The calf threw his horns at their torsos and the boys screamed. And then came the wind. The wind herself took the calf and the boys into her bosom and flew. She flew them up over the moon. She flew them up over their neighborhood and over their homes. They saw chickens in trees and duckies sleeping under children's beds through the windows. Harold held on tight to Oscar. He kissed Oscar's arm above where it had been bitten. Oscar leaned into Harold's chest. They took a deep breath and closed their eyes. This is the part we call the final act, in which our villain is vanquished. Unfortunately for you, however, his defeat brings little joy. It was in fact old man Toby himself who prayed that Jesus would comfort him that night. On this night, the calf saw huts flooded into and sinking down into Babylon, saw himself fly over the ocean, saw the moon glow like heavenly light. The wind herself dropped him down into the sea and he could feel himself burning. It made a hush sound like a hiss. He felt his horns break off into the water and watched them float along the current. He felt his fur wash off his skin, saw bits of fur float all around him. He felt himself melt into the ocean. It was at this point that he realized he could no longer feel his body. God, please tell me the plan, he said before disappearing into the sea. The wind herself forced Harold and Oscar to drink from her teat. In their last moments, the two lovers drank in mango peel, baby powder, Milo tins filled with pennies, hair grease, butterfly wings, and nail clippings. And when there was nothing left to swallow, they were made to swallow wind. She got inside of them, in their lungs, in their bellies, until they were finished. Just two bodies tossed and found by the side of the road before church on a Sunday. Nigel watched his brother fly up over the trees with Oscar and the wind before disappearing into rain. Nigel waved his arms frantically, trying to call out Harold's name, but the wind took his words every time. All that came out was and the shushing sound of the wind in his ears. His body sank down into the earth until he felt warm again, until he thought, maybe this isn't really happening, or maybe she'll take me too. Yes, Gilda went hard that night. Mud swallowed houses, goat and cow slipped and broke their necks. Puddles became lakes and rivers with tree branch, human limb, and uneaten fruit, drifting around like dead fish. Houses became seashells and got swept away. Wind wasn't angry. Truth is, girl was just hungry. Swallowed 6 people whole and spit them back out as bones. Harold, Oscar, and old man Toby were only 3. Thank you.
Let's give her another round of applause. We're gonna have an option for question and answer after everyone does their reading. So I know I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure you do too. I was transfixed by that surreal reading we had, so I can't wait to hear more about it. Our last author is Lita McCullough-Seletsky, and her book is The Kneeling Man, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Lita, please come on.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here. I want to say a very heartfelt thank you to Sankofa for hosting us in this wonderful and special space, and of course to the Hurston Wright Foundation and the team for organizing this. And so the title of the book pretty much says it all. There is a photo on the cover which shows the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of Memphis's Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968. Most of you have probably seen this photo. It is now in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I just visited again today with my mom. And so what it shows is Dr. King, who has just been shot, lying on his back. There are people who are standing around him pointing in the direction from which the gunshot was fired. And it's a very arresting photo, particularly with the dramatic pointing. But there's something else here in this photo. There's a person here who most people don't necessarily notice. There's a man who is kneeling beside Dr. King, and he is holding a towel to Dr. King's wounded jaw. And that man, his name is Morrell Mack McCullough, and the people on this balcony and on the scene believed that he was a Black activist, but in fact he was a spy. He was infiltrating an activist group called the Invaders on behalf of the Memphis Police Department. And so this book tells the story behind that. Why was he there? What did he witness and experience? How did it affect his life and the people around him? And what does this whole story tell us about America, and in particular, the experience of Black people and marginalized people in this country? And so I am going to read from the beginning, from page 1, chapter 1, scene 1, and this chapter is called Explosion. On Thursday, April 4th, 1968, just before 6 in the evening, 5 people stepped into the parking lot of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis and beheld a spectacle. No more than 10 yards away, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was leaning on the teal railing of the motel's second-floor balcony, talking to a small crowd below. He and the crowd were laughing, their words just beyond hearing range, as the last rays of sunlight glinted off the motel's rectangular picture windows. The group of 5 had been split between 2 cars, a cobalt blue Volkswagen Fastback and a white Pontiac Tempest, having just come from Claiborne Temple, where they were helping with grassroots efforts to support the city's striking sanitation workers. Their work wove an easy kinship between them, though one, the Volkswagen's driver, seemed a little quieter than the rest when conversation got going. They knew him as Morrell, the 23-year-old Minister of Transportation for a Black militant group called the Invaders. Others called him Mac. Just before noon that day, Mac had encountered 3 of them deep in conversation at the church. "Hey, let's see if Morrell will take us," said Clara, a brown-skinned student activist in bobby socks, as she gestured toward him. Standing beside her was Mary, another student activist, also in bobby socks. "Take you where?" he asked. "Shopping for 4-button overalls," Baby Jesus said. "I need them for the march." Baby Jesus was what they called James Orange, aide to King and project coordinator for his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. The nickname was ironic, given the man's 6'3", 300-pound frame. He towered over Mac, not himself a small man, at a muscular 6 feet tall, plus a 2-inch afro. But Baby Jesus' long goatee sprouted from a cherubic ebony face, with gentle eyes framed by horn-rimmed glasses. He'd been in town all week with colleagues from the SCLC, preparing for King's next big march for the sanitation workers. Mac nodded. 4-button overalls were part of that peasant farmer vibe, the de rigueur look for a poor people's demonstration. Clara had a car and could have taken baby Jesus shopping herself, but why not let the Invaders' transportation minister do the driving? They piled into Mac's car, first stopping at the shops along Main Street. Finding nothing, they checked the venerable old Goldsmith's department store downtown, which carried a variety of menswear, but not the overalls. Someone recommended checking the new Sears out east on Poplar Avenue. No luck. The pattern repeated itself all over town as they combed store after store without success. Finally, they returned to Claiborne Temple, where they ran into the fiery and slightly built James Bevel, who managed the SCLC's direct action and nonviolent education programs. By now, it was getting close to dinner time. Baby Jesus invited the college students to share a meal at the Lorraine, the SCLC's base of operations in Memphis. Bevel was planning to head there too, and it made sense for Mac to come along. The SCLC had rented the Invaders a couple of rooms while the two groups were in talks about the role the Invaders might play in the upcoming march. The 5 of them decided to carpool over, with Mac driving baby Jesus and Bevel, while Clara drove Mary. Dressed in jeans and a lightweight pullover jacket, Mac walked toward Clara's car, parked behind his. He recognized a few people in the crowd near King's balcony, members of a gospel group called the Operation Breadbasket Band. Orange and Bevel walked in their direction. Mac exchanged a few words with Clara and Mary. Just then, a thunderous boom echoed through the air. Mac looked up and saw King fall backward to the balcony floor. "Dr. King has been shot!" screamed someone in the crowd. Mac looked out in the direction opposite where King had been standing, toward a couple of ramshackle buildings across Mulberry Street. He saw no one, either in the buildings or on the ground. His eyes swept the parking lot, the streets, the sidewalks. No one running, no one with a gun. Then he spotted a cluster of movement across Mulberry Street. People were running out of the rear door of the fire station just opposite the motel. He looked at the balcony again. One of King's aides, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, peered out from behind an adjacent window toward King's fallen body. The next thing Mac knew, his legs were carrying him toward King, sprinting up an external staircase and onto the second-floor balcony. Had he stopped to consider a course of action and the possible consequences, he probably would have melted into the crowd, but something automatic propelled him. As he reached the balcony, it occurred to him that the shooter might not be finished. He dropped to a crawl and made his way to King, grabbing a white towel from a cleaning cart along the way. Mac's eyes locked on the gaping hole on the right side of King's head and neck as it gushed blood onto the gray concrete. The wound began around his cheekbone, traveling down under his Adam's apple. It looked strange the way the flesh erupted outward, torn back. Droplets of blood speckled the front of King's shirt from the collar to the middle of his torso. Mac's mind searched for methods to stop the bleeding. There were only two: a tourniquet, which obviously wouldn't work here, and pressure. He pressed the towel into the wound. Who did this? He wondered. Where did the shot come from? He remembered basic training in the Army, where he learned a technique for figuring out a trajectory or navigating from a fixed point back to where you'd come from. They called it shooting a back azimuth. He looked at King's position on the balcony floor. When King was talking to the people below, he was standing parallel to the balcony, leaning over the railing. He fell at an angle, about 45 degrees to the left, relative to the railing. The shot must have come from his right side, pushing him back and to the left. And the wound looked like it had a downward trajectory. Putting it all together, the shot came from above and to the right, from the back of one of those old buildings across the street, the top floor. Mac counted 1, 2, 3 windows over, a little window about half the height of the other two, right there. Had to be. Down in the courtyard, throngs of people milled about, sobbing and wailing. Sirens shrieked in every direction, red and blue lights glinting on the motel window panes. Help was coming. One of them needs to get over there to where the shot came from, he thought. Clara and Mary now stood feet away from him on the balcony, screaming and pointing across the street. Potent, suffocating odors closed in. Burning gunpowder and a sweet cologne overlying sulfurous notes from King's facial hair depilatory. Mac felt a surge of nausea. Why was the gunpowder odor so intense? The gun had been fired all the way across the street, most likely from inside a building. It didn't make any sense. Unless you put it together with the extruded flesh of the wound, the shot's thunderous sound, the spray of blood on King's shirt. Even if the shot's sound and the wound and the blood spatter could be explained away, what about the concentrated gunpowder smell? Taken together, the details painted a picture he could scarcely believe. The bullet that hit King exploded on impact, as if it contained some kind of incendiary charge. But how could that be? He'd never heard of such a thing, even in the Army. A bullet like that wouldn't be sold in a gun shop. It had to be advanced technology. People gathered around Mac and King on the balcony, and soon Reverend Ralph Abernathy, King's chief aide, knelt next to King. He placed his hand on the towel, taking over from Mac. Mac rose, bloodstains making his jacket cling to the left side of his chest. He spotted a police officer nearby, a white man, and the white color of his shirt indicated he was a lieutenant. "I'm an undercover police officer," he said, speaking close to the man's ear. "The shot came from that building across the street, from that window." He pointed to the half-size window. "I heard the shot and I heard it and I saw him fall. I saw how it hit him, the way his body was lying. If you line him up from his head to his feet and add an elevation, that's the trajectory." The lieutenant looked across the courtyard at the window. As the lieutenant looked across the courtyard at the window, Mac walked away. Seeing Mary and Clara sobbing and keening nearby, he knew he needed to get them away from the scene. He led them down an external staircase and into the parking lot, which swarmed with police. One of the officers told everyone to remain in the area, so the three of them stood around, waiting. Mary and Clara left after a while, and Mac decided to go to the motel lobby. He found a chair and sat in it. A few people sat nearby while others meandered through, the mood funereal and hushed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really felt like I was there. Could we please get another chair? We're gonna have Q&A and all three of the authors are gonna be up on the stage. So get ready with your questions and we'll try to take as many as we can. I can't imagine what it took for the three of you to delve in so deeply and to give so much detail and pour so much into yourself. Thank you so much to our able assistant here. This is David Whetstone, who is a board member for Hurston Wright. Let's give him a round of applause. He has been working really hard every day, calling me, texting me. He's been doing a great job, so we appreciate him. So if the authors could come forward and take a seat, and then I will kind of go around the space and get some questions. Got our first question. Let me bring the mic so they can hear you.
I have a question for Victor. Yes, sure. I was curious what it was like for you to go to Greenwood.
Greenwood.
what was that experience like, and what were your experiences there that informed how you wrote the book?
Sure, so, I don't know, she's my.
There's another one up
Yeah.
there. Just press the button.
Thank you. Testing. Great, thank you so much for the question. So like I said before I did my reading, one of my main goals was to tell a fuller story of Greenwood. I think that the Race Massacre itself, this event in 1921, one of the most vicious acts of racial terror in our country's history, it's been buried for a very long time, and it's really, I think, a positive thing that more folks know about it now. But in some ways, it's kind of like taking over the Greenwood narrative. And so a lot of folks who are from that neighborhood, of course, they're pursuing justice, but they also don't want it to only be defined by their trauma. And so for me, I realized that the only way to tell the story in a way that felt authentic and really honoring that community's history was to be there, you know? So actually, I been living in Atlanta before the project, working as a business reporter, and I actually ended up quitting my job, making a Black country music playlist, and moving out to Tulsa to pursue this project. It was your Old Town Road came out, perfect time to go out there. But for me, I think being there and in this space with folks really helped me kind of get a different perspective. It helped me to understand sort of how they actually navigated finding the success of quote-unquote Black Wall Street, and I saw some of those traumas continue to linger on. And so I think the book that I wrote has a lot more heart, verve, soul, maybe some spirit of the ancestors in it, because I actually spent time living in the space as opposed to just going there every once in a while to write the story.
Thank you. Another question?
This is also a question for Victor. So I know that we're, as a culture, we're underinformed about Greenwood, even given the massive attention since I guess that Watchmen episode came out. It kind of refixated people onto Greenwood and Black Wall Street. So understanding that we are underinformed and that's a big issue, what's of what we think we know about Black Wall Street and Greenwood is wrong?
It's right there in the name, Black Wall Street. So when I started the project, I really had the Black Wall Street mythology. I was very caught up in it, and I wanted to write a book, honestly, that was going to be about like Black excellence, like Black folks sort of creating this utopia for themselves in Tulsa of all places. And that was kind of my mission. And then when I started doing the research, I'm finding out like, oh, actually, there's a lot of poverty in Greenwood. Oh, actually, like the roads weren't paved early on. They didn't have lights and all this stuff. And so I had to kind of like reevaluate what I was trying to do with my project. And so I realized it was much more about, not about Black Wall Street, but about Black life. And so the book itself ended up being much more about all of these different folks from different classes, from different backgrounds, of different economic stations, working together to build this space up together. And so I think that sometimes we can get a little caught up in the Black excellence mythology, you know? And so I think a story that's more about real folks living their lives here, whether they had a penny or $100, to find a way to sort of find connection in that space. That became much more what the book was about. And so I was really glad that I was sort of challenged in that way by the facts, because they kind of undercut some of that mythology.
Thank you. My question is for Soroya. What made you write this book? It was so fanciful, but I felt like I was right there. So what kind of took you down that path?
Well, I mean, I come from a family of storytellers, I would say. Like my dad used to tell me about the rolling calf growing up. My mom would talk about the Lagahoo's in Trinidad, and I also was just really into fairy tales and folklore in general. So I would read, you know, the Anansi storybooks, but also like Hans Christian Andersen, like all the books. I was really obsessed, and I think as I got older, I was really interested in like why we keep retelling those stories, and how a lot of like Caribbean folklore and African folklore, Black folklore can be, it's not really like, you know, in a lot of European fairy tales where it's like, oh, there's one villain, there's one hero, this is the happy ending. But a lot of them were more, you know, like Anansi could be a villain and a hero. And I felt like a lot more about questioning power through stories, you know, like, how like a little spider can overcome lions and tigers through storytelling. Like that was just always really interesting to me, and I feel like it's the kind of thing that it seems like it makes sense that it would come from a place that was colonized, and it was told you have no power, and yet we have, you know, steel pen and carnival and like all of these things that, you know, we would use to reclaim power, and mock colonization. So I think that it became a way for me to tell that story. The Rolling Calf in particular, I think, was just more of one of the scarier ones. And I'm like a reluctant horror fan. Like I like it, but I also don't really like to be scared. But I like eerie things. And my dad, who's doesn't eat meat, like he would always say like, oh, it's, you know, the butcher is being punished and he becomes the rolling calf when he dies. But like, I've learned that's not how everybody hears that story. That's how my dad tells the story. And so I think that like everybody kind of has their own little, they put themselves into the folklore, I guess.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Leah, I was transfixed by what you shared, and so was there any point where you said, maybe I shouldn't tell this story? What will they think about my dad? What do I think about my dad? You know, where we are right now, what were your thoughts when you approached this project?
Yes, so I think that for the first 3 decades of my life, I had that thought, you know, maybe I shouldn't tell this story. I mean, of course, I didn't know much about the story until I was a teenager. You know, I grew up with a lot of silences around the story. I knew that my father was in the photograph, but all I knew about that was that he was a Memphis police officer. And it was only later that I learned from the newspaper, in an article that was published about the story, that he was an undercover police officer who had infiltrated a Black activist group. And it was at that point when I really did have that fear of what people would think, and also just not wanting to open that can of worms. And it was only much later, after, you know, I was well into adulthood and I had 2 children, that it occurred to me that the silence that I grew up with and the fear surrounding the story was not a legacy that I wanted to pass down to my children. And so that is when I decided that it was imperative that I open that can of worms and delve into it. And you know, no matter what I found, the truth-telling part of it and the historical puzzle piece that would be uncovered was actually on the other side of the fear and the trepidation. And so it was always going to be worth it.
Thank you for your bravery. Any other questions?
I have a question about, I guess the different fields of research you had to go into for that. So because I was very fascinated by how many different places that excerpt went into visual culture with examining the photograph and even forensics with the detail about the technology of the bullet, kind of implicating that it must have been some kind of military or police technology that came from. So I would kind of like to know a little bit more about like your research process and like how did forensics come into play, and just because it just seems like you went into so many different fields to even write that chapter in and of itself. So I kind of like would like to know more about like the research project process and the different places you had to go with it.
The research was a lot. And, you know, at the same time, it was really foundational in order to be able to tell the story responsibly and accurately. And so it was a process that I began in 2015 and finished in 2022. So it was a period of years. And the most important part of the research was getting the first person account from my father himself. And so I recorded many, many dozens of hours of interviews with him, some in person, but mostly over the phone, transcribed those interviews and created a new primary resource in the world to hear from an eyewitness what occurred. And so I was able to learn certain facts from that, and, you know, shooting a back azimuth, for example, things like that. But, you know, of course, I couldn't just transcribe what my father told me and call that a book. So I had to corroborate as much as I could. I had to talk to experts. I had to get information, for example, from the National Archives through a Freedom of Information Act request, FBI documents that were housed there. And so the process really, took place in stages. The foundation was the interviews with my father, but then also just acquiring the documents through Freedom of Information Act, talking to experts, the ballistics experts, reading other research and what other people had written, and really just continuing to just drill down and get as much granular information as I could and putting it together in a way that didn't read like the encyclopedia, hopefully.
So was your father at all reluctant to talk about this by the time you asked him?
He was surprisingly willing to talk about it to the point where when I finally asked him out of the blue in my very inelegant way, breaking the ice after 35 or whatever years, he almost seemed relieved. Like, almost as if he were thinking, well, finally she asked me, because it's sort of like, hey, Dad, how you doing? Yeah. So we never talked about the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, but he was very willing and I think he was very brave in telling, everything that he could, that he knew and experienced. And so without his cooperation, it wouldn't have been possible.
Thank you.
Is it okay to ask everyone to answer this question?
Absolutely.
Is this everyone's first book debut? Yes. Okay, just making sure. I think I just have like a process question. As a debut author, I'm wondering if you can talk about the moment in your writing, whether it was when you were pitching the book or whether you finished the last chapter, whatever that was, when you knew I've really got something here. This is gonna be a book that takes me around the world into to events like this.
Thank you for the question. I've never been asked this question before. I think that for me, when it all came together, I guess I would say actually I remember very specifically, starting a book is the hardest part. And so I read the chapter one, but I didn't read the prologue of the book, and that was kind of I had to figure out how to set the book in modern times in Tulsa. And so there's this guy named Jim Goodwin whose family's at the center of the book, and I read about his ancestors as my first part of my reading. And I was interviewing Jim dozens of times, kind of like you interviewing your father. You do so many interviews, you're kind of trying to figure out what's going to actually kind of click. And so one day when I was interviewing Jim in his office on Greenwood Avenue, he was like, "Oh, I've ever read for you my essay about the race massacre. What is your essay about the race massacre?" And he put out this essay he written in 1960 about the race massacre in 1921. And so that moment when I was with him in his office, we were alone. It's like a really quiet day on Greenwood, where we're in 2020. He's reading an essay written in 1960 about 1921. That sort of collision of eras and times. I knew I wanted my book to collapse time in some ways like that. And so when he read that to me, I knew how the book was going to start. And so I think that kind of locked in for me, that it was going to be something that would kind of come together. So I think for me, it was kind of doing tons and tons of interviews and finding that one interview that I just knew had a spark to it that would really kind of pull everything together.
I kind of wrote my book by accident in a way. I started writing these stories within stories about this family who liked to tell stories. And I started doing that in undergrad. And they were different characters each time, but kind of also the same characters. And I think at some point in my MFA program, I think somebody in my workshop just said, "Oh, this should be a book." I was like, okay. And I wasn't necessarily even thinking it would be a novel. I was like, these are sort of linked stories. But I think I realized that a lot of them were kind of I realized, I think, as I was writing it, that it had a specific arc, and that I'm like, oh, this actually could be a novel, and I think that I had to work with my agent and my editor to actually make it a novel as opposed to stories that were similar. So I feel like it took officially like 10 years, but really more than that. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I actually started the process of asking my dad about the story by having in my mind the idea that it should be a book. And I remember our first conversation where I asked him about the assassination. I said, by the way, this should be a book. Like, we should write a, which is incredibly naive. I mean, I look back now and I just think, like, why was I so convinced? But I think it was just because of the idea of preserving this story, and that whatever I learned was a piece of American history that, didn't exist until I got it and put it together. And that, as Black people, all too often we are mined for content, but we don't often have the platforms and the ability to actually create and control the content and tell the story versus being the subject of these stories. And so I think that kind of drove the process and was the lens through which I always looked at it, and just in terms of documentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Soraya. Kind of a random question. If your book were a TV show or a movie, who would play Nigel?
Oh, I thought about this before, and I wanted to be now I'm gonna forget his name.
What character did he play? We don't know.
He's in Us. He's the dad, and he's in Black Panther. He's from Tobago.
Oh, Winston Duke?
Yeah. Even though technically Nigel is Jamaican, but I don't know. I just see it. I can just see him being Nigel and playing him with like some heart and empathy.
Okay. Do we have? This is your opportunity. These are budding authors. You can say, I knew them when. Okay. I think that culminates our Q&A. But what I will ask all of you, if you're on social media, if you're on Instagram, if you could take out your smartphones and go and look for Hurston Wright Foundation. And I would like for you all to follow us and post maybe a picture that you've taken, or take one of the authors. Obviously, we would like you all to purchase their books and tell other people about it. I feel really honored to be able to hear from each one of them individually and collectively. The power of books, the power of stories is timeless, and it really reverberates. So I think in 10, 20 years, we'll still be going back to these books and looking at them and thinking about them. And I think this is just the beginning of their careers. So I'm excited to see what they're going to be doing moving forward. So we are going to have Martu to come forward and talk about some of the upcoming programs. And let's give Sankofa Books another round of applause. We really appreciate them hosting us, purchasing the books, and really giving us a platform, because this is how the information gets out. And I encourage you to come to their future programs.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, everyone that came out. Thank you to the lovely authors that took time out of their busy schedules, I'm sure, to share their work with us and to read with us and answer our questions. I truly appreciate it. Before we conclude the programming, I wanted to go over some of our upcoming events here at Sankofa, and hopefully we'll get to see some of you back here. So on Saturday in the afternoon, we have Saturday, October 19th, from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. in the afternoon, we have a young sister from Nigeria. She's also an astrologer, coming here straight from Nigeria to launch her book. It's a children's book. It's called Melanin Magic, A Young Mystic's Guide to African Spirituality. We have the books available already if you'd like to purchase it, so please make sure you come out here and support her. On the same day, October 19th, from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., we have another young sister from Ethiopia. Her name is Efrata. She'll be showcasing her artwork. She's a painter, so we'll have that available as well. Sunday, for those of you that haven't been able to make it, we've been doing a tribute to the great Amiri Baraka. The first event, we had personal letters we shared with family members and discussions. The second day, we had his poetry reading. And the third and final part, which is called Baraka the Playwright, we are doing his play reading, and also we're screening the film directed by St. Clair Bourne. It's called In Motion, Amiri Baraka, this Sunday starting 7 p.m. So, yeah, if you can, come out and enjoy. This is the conclusion of the big celebration we've been having. Yeah, I'm not gonna bore you. I'm gonna keep it short. If you'd like to know more about our events, visit our website. It's www.sankofa.com. Our social media is Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Sankofa DC. Come out and enjoy the program we have lined up for you guys. Thank you so much.
You want to be in front of the table? Maybe that's better? Yeah, let's be in front of the table. And why don't you all hold your foot? Okay. Okay, scoot down a little bit so everybody, are we good? Are we positioned? Okay, excellent.
Yes, this is good. All right. 1, 2, 3, cheese. I'll take a few.
Thank
Do it now. Okay.
Okay, and then another gentleman's taking pictures.
Oh, let me get out of the way.
I'm from South Africa.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing from all of you, and I'll see everybody tomorrow. Okay. What, 24 hours? Less.
Yeah, right.
We'll be there.
Tomorrow at 7, right?
6:30 for check-in, and if you wanted to